I'm here today at William Wallace Auctioneers and I'm looking at some very special lots which I'm going to share with you. And this first one that I'm going to show you is something which, if you're an owner of Records of the Medieval Sword by Oakeshott, you might recognise. But hopefully you're going to get a better look at it now together with some stats. And it is this wonderful late 15th century, perhaps early 16th century longsword. Hi folks, I'm Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria. Now first up, thanks a lot to William Wallace for letting me come and film today. I contacted them because I noticed some things in their upcoming auction, which is on the 27th and 28th of November 2024. I'm afraid if that date is in the past when you see this video, the auction's already happened. But if you're seeing this before that date, then it's your chance to bid on maybe this. Now, this is a wonderful late 15th century longsword, and this caught my eye as soon as I saw it in the auction catalogue because I immediately recognised it from Oakeshott's Records of the Medieval Sword. Incidentally, if you don't own that book, you absolutely must if you like medieval swords. It is one of the Bibles of medieval swords and documents a lot of the medieval swords which are currently in major collections, private and public, today. Now, looking at Oakeshott's Records of the Medieval Sword, we see one photograph of this and some measurements. Now, the first thing I'm going to address at the very beginning of this is that you have to take some of the measurements when it comes to length or weight or things like that in Records of the Medieval Sword, unfortunately with a pinch of salt, and this is no exception. Over the years, I've managed to document, measure and handle a number of swords which are in Records of the Medieval Sword, and unfortunately, amazing gift that he gave to the world with all of his books, wasn't that precise with measurements, unfortunately. So I think in Records of the Medieval Sword, he says that the blade of this is about 35 inches long. He even gives it in centimetres, I think, as well, but actually it's 31 centimetres long. So at the outset, we have to say that this isn't exactly as it is recorded in Records of the Medieval Sword, but I'm going to give you all of the measurements in this video, so hang with me for that. It's actually a little bit shorter than that, and it is therefore a fairly short longsword. So while it does have a two-handed grip, we'll talk about the grip in a minute, it's actually not a very long sword. It's probably more what we would term a bastard sword or a hand-and-a-half sword. So it's not a big two-hander, even though if you just saw a picture on a page, you might think this was a big two-handed sword. I can tell you it's not. The length of the blade is about the same as an arming sword. It just happens to have a long grip. So this is a sword that would be eminently capable of being worn at your side, in armour, in civilian life. Quite convenient to wear. So, where does it come from? Possibly German. We're not really sure. Now, the first thing to say is this is an unusual form of blade. You will notice, and we'll look a bit more detail in a second, but you'll notice that this blade has multiple fullers, and this is what Oakeshott in his typology put as his type 20. So it's a multifaceted, should we say, surface. It's even more than a hexagonal section, which we encounter quite often actually in medieval swords. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 facets on each side. So you could say, rather than having 6 faces, this has 10. I'm not even sure what shape that makes this. Actually, the fullers in a second. So an interesting detail about this sword is, two very interesting things, apart from the blade, which is quite unusual, is the grip. Oakeshott believed that to be the original grip. I actually have no particular reason to doubt him, and one of the reasons is, if we look down here on the the junction between the grip and the guard, you will see some leather overlapping on the guard here. And Oakeshott talks about this in his book, and he considers that part of a rain guard, as they're commonly known. In other words, a flap or covering of leather which comes down over the guard and probably originally projected down below the guard to here. This is most famously seen on some swords from Munich. And that might mean that this is a German sword, because that was a particularly German feature, firstly. So, on the other side, of the grip, we don't have as much of the leather remaining. But there is an interesting detail. If we just look at the center of the guard for a second, just around here, again, Oakeshott noted that it's quite rough and unfinished here, which might suggest that the person who made the guard was also the same person who made the grip, and the leather was designed to cover that section, and therefore they didn't finish this midsection. They finished the quillons, or arms, of the guard out here, but they didn't polish and file smooth that center section because that was going to be covered by this leather, the leather of the grip, which comes down and forms a rain guard. That rain guard forms a bit of a tube, and when it goes into the scabbard comes up inside that tube, therefore keeping the blade watertight and safe from the elements, hence the name rain guard or rain flap. Right, so the grip is a waisted design. You'll notice it has risers in the middle. The risers are intended to keep your right hand, or your dominant hand, you might be left-handed, in place, so that your hand, when you're holding the sword one-handed, for example on horseback, your hand doesn't slide down when you swing the sword. So as is common on many long swords, the widest portion of the blade is in the center. So it's a waisted grip, essentially. Quite typical, and you'll notice it has these ridged features here, which are representative probably of cord on the wood underneath. So it's a wooden grip with cord, then leather over the top, and then stitched down the side here. So another really characteristic and interesting thing about this sword are these three recesses on the face here. Now, if you look in Ewart Oakeshott's book, Records of the Medieval Sword, this is there's a black and white photo, and it's quite fuzzy and not very clear. You can't, for example, very clearly see the detail of the guard, which we'll look at in a second. But you can see these three recesses because they're very, very prominent and very deep. But there's only three of them. I think when I first saw the photo of that sword, I assumed that these recesses went all the way around, but they do not. And moreover, this pommel very clearly has a front and a back. If we look at it that way, you can see it's actually smooth on the back, and then the facets are predominantly on the front. Now, what do I mean by front and back? Well, in fact, we know this was a right-handed person who bought this sword, or rather, it was made for a right-handed person for two reasons. One, a right-handed person wears the sword on the left. Now, if we put that there, that faces outwards, okay? But secondly, if we hold the sword here, the general convention is that the guard curls in at the front and out at the back. If we were left-handed, that would be the wrong way around. Anyway, back to the pommel. So it is an asymmetrical pommel, as you can see here, with cool incised lines, but they are not symmetrical, as you can see. So the facets are on the front, and it's smooth on the back. Obviously, because your friends and your peers and your superiors would marvel at the detail and decorative expense that you'd gone to on the outside of your pommel when you were wearing it, but they wouldn't be able to see the inside. This is actually quite a common feature we find with later side swords and rapiers, where the decoration is predominantly, or sometimes entirely, on the outside, and it's smooth on the inside. Also, from a sort of functional point of view, having a smooth inside is more comfortable against your body and less likely to wear holes in your valuable clothes. So, the pommel, asymmetrical, designed for show. What are those recesses for? I can literally hear some of you guessing right now. So Ewart Oakeshott's guess was that there used to be little figures inside here, perhaps made of silver or gold and therefore robbed out. I don't know. It's very, very difficult to say because there's nothing inside here which really gives any clue to there being anything attached at any time. So it's possible there were figures in there, very difficult to say. It's possible those were filled, maybe there was enamel in there. There's nothing there now. There's no stippling, there's no attachment points. I don't know. It's possible they were always hollow. It's impossible to say. Right, onto the guard. So the guard is known as an S guard, or essentially reversed S, curled round quillons each side. And as mentioned, when you're holding it in your dominant hand, in my case right hand, most people would have been right-handed and still are, curling to the inside line, on the front and to the outside line, protecting the wrist and forearm on the back. So it has a functional use to be curved like that. Okay. Also, if you're wearing it, that makes more sense because against your body, the rear quillon will now be curling away from the body instead of into the body. If it was curling in this way, it would keep digging in your ribs. Whereas the front quillon, which will be in front of your body, that can curl inwards and it's out of the way, it doesn't matter. Right, okay, so before we get onto the stats, we're going to talk about this blade cross section. So as mentioned, it does have 10 facets, sort of. So it's really quite complicated, this blade, hence Oakeshott putting it into this quite late number in his typology, type 20. So we start off with essentially a blade that's almost, if you imagine, lozenge shaped, or perhaps sort of flattened diamond shape, but then it has a fuller in the center. Okay, so let's come up close. You'll notice it has a fuller in the center going up here. And that carries on all the way up until here. Okay, but either side of that center one are two other fullers, okay, above and below here. And then you've got the bevels for the cutting edge. Now, when we get to this point, which is some distance down the blade, it then transitions into only having just these outer two, and that center one fades out. Now, funnily enough, this, by pure coincidence, is very similar to a cinquedea that you will have seen featured on my channel in the Royal Armouries. And in fact, last week I was handling this cinquedea at the Royal Armouries, and it actually has a similar treatment of, that goes from 3 fullers down to 2. So it's a similar situation to this, except in that case it's further down the blade down here. In terms of the overall silhouette, however, so if we ignore the fullers, we could say this is very similar to an Oakeshott Type 18. So if we're looking at this from the functional point of view of this is just a sword for fighting with, then actually, functionally, this is very similar to an Oakeshott Type 18. And you wouldn't really notice any difference in use. Really, the Type 20 group is only to take account of the fact that they have these multiple fullers. Now, if we come back to the origin for a second. So on one hand, we've got some information about the hilt with the leather flap, which might indicate a Munich or a German, Bavarian or German origin for this sword. In terms of the S quillons, that is a feature we find quite often on a number of German swords. So you could say that the grip and the guard are pointing towards a German origin. The pommel could be found in a number of places. We can find those in England, France, Italy, all over. So it's quite a common overall shape of scent stopper pommel. These 3 facets don't really have a strong parallel, as far as I know, in any of the other documented swords. However, if we come to the blade, in my opinion, we've only got one maker's mark, which might give us a potential clue down here, which is a little star just there. You can see that. But apart from that mark, I can't see any others. There's no running wolf of Passau or anything like that. So, my opinion is that it's possible this blade is Italian, based on the multiple fullering, which is a feature we see at the end of the 15th century in Italy and early 16th century, most famously on cinquedea, but we do also find it on arming swords and long swords like this. So, my guess, and this is only a guess, would be that it's an Italian exported blade, probably from Milan or Brescia, hilted, possibly in Germany, could also potentially be Scandinavia, southern Scandinavian. So there we go. In terms of dating, really actually quite difficult to date. I would probably say the end of the 15th century, so late 1400s, possibly just edging into the early 1500s. But it's an absolutely wonderful sword. Now, I know that some of you are absolutely gagging to know the stats of this bad boy, so let's have a look at some of the numbers. So, first of all, the total length is 105.5 centimeters. This is all going to be in metric, by the way. The blade length, contrary to what you at Oakeshott wrote, it's actually about 10 centimeters shorter than what he put. It's actually, the length of the blade is 79 centimeters, which is about 31 inches. It's quite short for a longsword. However, it's quite heavy. We'll get to the weight in a second. The fuller in the center, some of you might be wondering, is 49 centimeters long. The length of the grip that I'm holding here is 20 centimeters, and the length of the whole hilt is 26.5 centimeters. I'm not going to give all of the measurements because it might get too boring for you, but I know some of you will want to know about the distal taper. Now, this is an interesting topic. So this is the way that the blade starts off thicker here and gets thinner down here. Now, since I've been doing these videos and doing this documentation, I have found that some swords either have more distal taper than you might think or have less distal taper than you might think. Some swords have barely any distal taper at all. So don't believe anyone who gives sweeping statements about distal taper on medieval swords because it varies. But this one actually has a fair amount of distal taper. It is 8.6 millimeters thick at the base. So 8.6 millimeters, which is actually quite typical for a longsword. Perhaps, yeah, it's about typical, I would say. So 8.6 millimeters. Then if we come down to the middle, it is about 4.9 millimeters. Okay, so that's a big reduction from 8.6 down to 4.9. And then 3 centimeters from the tip, it is 3.9 millimeters, sorry. So we've gone from 8.6 millimeters, 4.9 millimeters to 3.9 millimeters. Now, there's a couple of things to say there. Firstly, that's not immensely thin up here, okay? So 3.9 millimeters is still quite thick, and this is therefore a stiff blade. It starts off very thick, but it's still fairly thick at the middle and really doesn't get that thin near the tip. But there is another detail which you have to be aware of with this sword, and that is it has a reinforced tip. So just before that, it comes down to 3.9 millimeters, but then it slightly swells at the tip. Now that's an important detail for a couple of reasons. One, it tells us that that is the real tip. This isn't a reduced blade because it wouldn't get thicker then, it would stay thin. So very unlikely that this was a longer blade that's being cut down, in my opinion. It could potentially have been shortened from the back end, but then we've got issues around the dating of the hilt. So, reinforced tip, that's the first thing. Secondly, why would you have a reinforced tip? Well, I've covered this in multiple videos looking at both medieval swords, but also things like Indian Qatar punch daggers. It's to deal with armor. So this is a sword which is intended to go against armor. That means it's unlikely that it's primarily intended for civilian wear. It probably is a battlefield sword, the kind of sword that you would wear in armor, use in armor, and fight against armor. Reinforced tip, of course, has two main purposes. One, to punch through mail or chain mail at the voiders, the gaps in the armor. But also, if you do happen to hit plate with it while you're half swording, it's less likely to break the tip off because it's been reinforced. So the final measurements for you. The guard from tip to tip measured in a straight line, obviously it's an S-curve, but if you measure it this way, is 21 centimeters. The point of balance, interestingly, is 7.5 centimeters, quite typical actually for a sword like this, and the weight is 1,610 grams, 1610 grams. So it's actually quite heavy. For an arming sword, that would be really quite heavy. For a long sword, it's not too bad. Overall, in terms of how this, the impression I get in handling this, it's quite small for a long sword, and it's quite heavy. So in my opinion, this is a sword which is really made for battlefield use, wearing in armor, using against armor. This is the sort of sword that could have been carried at somewhere like the Battle of Bosworth if it was in England, but I think that this is probably a continental sword that would have been carried probably somewhere in Germany, Switzerland, Austria, somewhere like this. And but it is a martial sword, I believe. So this is the sort of sword that you'd wear at your side as a backup to the lance on horseback or the poleaxe or the spear on foot. And it's a good battlefield fighting sword. There's nothing fancy about it. There's no decoration on the blade. There's no gilding. There's no engraving that we might find at this time. The grip, I think, is original. You at Oakeshott certainly thought it was original, and it's wonderful to see and grip it. I mean, if it's not the original grip, then why would it have the remainders of the rain flaps there and the clear evidence on the guard showing that it probably was covered? I think he's right. I think it is the original grip. So it's an amazing, wonderful sword. And I have to thank William Wallace for letting me get my hands on this and letting me measure it, because, of course, this is a sword which many of us know from records of the medieval sword by you at Oakeshott. It's a wonderful piece, amazing sword, wonderful survival, beautiful condition, and it's legendary also because it's been published as well. So it's really great to actually find out the real accurate data for this thing and to hold it. What an honor. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope this has been a good sword to finally be able to see and see better images of than you would have had in Ewart Oakeshott's book. And I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. And also remember to check out the auction catalogue for William Wallace's upcoming sale on the 27th and 28th of November. Down below, you can find a link to that there. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.